This is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Leoneda Inge. There's a book that explores how the federal government and housing developers all but conspired to segregate schools and neighborhoods after the New Deal. We talked to Karen Benjamin, author of Good Parents, Better Homes, and Great Schools.
School segregation and residential segregation are two sides of the same coin. They are reinforcing each other. You can't address one without the other.
And there's a new threat to honeybees, our great pollinators.
And then when they're coming home, the hornets will attack them, behead them.
Oh my God. So they're like serial killers.
Yeah, basically.
More on an invasive hornet from the Broadside and the historic link between housing and school segregation on Due South. The news is next. Hi there. I'm Leoneda Inge, host of Due South. Thanks for listening and supporting our podcasts. We work smart to bring you the best North Carolina and the South have to offer, from the latest in state politics to important voices in race and Southern culture. Due South is here every day. But we couldn't do it without your financial support. Thank you. If you like what you're hearing, please consider making a donation today at WUNC.org. From the American Tobacco Historic District in downtown Durham, this is Due South on WUNC. I'm Leoneda Inge. For nearly a century, neighborhood segregation and school segregation have been closely linked, and that link has been intentional. It was a joint effort beginning with the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s. The FHA worked in concert with housing developers to appeal to well-meaning white parents hoping to provide the best possible education for their small children. And despite efforts to change that, these systemic plans to create exclusive residential communities, neighborhoods, and schools continue today. A new book by Professor Karen Benjamin of Elmhurst University in Illinois explores this long and complex history. It's called Good Parents, Better Homes, and Great Schools, Selling Segregation Before the New Deal. Karen, welcome to Due South.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Glad to have you here. This is a hot topic. I think it will never go away as we hear stories of not just housing segregation still today, but school desegregation and resegregation, and then, of course, charter schools. I mean, it just will not stop. But your book...
Absolutely. And the new and vouchers for private schools.
Oh, definitely. In North Carolina, that is a big issue because I think it was just determined that many, if not most, of the vouchers for private schools were going to families who were already in private school. It right. Wasn't even...
And have the income to pay for it.
And they have the income to pay for it. Well, this book, your book has been in the making, I know, for a long time, for decades. You wrote this article a while back for the Journal of Urban History called Suburbanizing Jim Crow. Is that what sparked your interest in this topic?
So that article actually came out of research that I was doing for my dissertation at Duke University. And one of the archivists suggested I look at a manuscript collection of a Black teacher and Black principal, actually, in Raleigh, Charles Hunter. And I was looking through that collection, and I found this letter that was written by his niece, who didn't live in Raleigh. I think she lived in D.C. And she was sympathizing with him because he had spent decades trying to get a school for his neighborhood. And it was the College Park neighborhood, just south of St. Augustine's, for those who are familiar with that area. And those were single-family homes, owner-occupied, and their children had to walk a long distance to get to a Black school. And so he'd been requesting a school for that area since, the early part of the century. And so his niece was sympathizing with him. And she said, they're just trying to get all of us segregated in the southeast side of the city. And I was like, whoa. And it was just a phenomenal document. I didn't know that I needed it for my dissertation or how I would use it, but I knew it was important, right? That started all of it, was to find out, like, what is she talking about? And was that true? And it turned out that absolutely 100% that was true, that the school board was intentionally placing Black schools in the southeast section of the city and closing schools everywhere else. So, in the late 19th century, there were more Black schools on the west side of Raleigh than on the east side. So, think about the change that you have there. And at the same time, the newest and most modern white schools were all going over, starting to go over to the west side and the northwest side. And at that time, a modern school meant something, right? It was fireproof. It wasn't made of wood. There were fires all the time. You had sanitation facilities, toilets inside the building, not outside, right? This was a significant change to have a new school. And so it was very clear that the school board was intentionally opening schools and ignoring schools to kind of shape where people lived. So then the book kind of came about because I thought, what's going on elsewhere? And started looking at, other cities, including Atlanta and Winston-Salem. And as I was doing that research and really looking at that connection between residential segregation and school segregation, I'll never forget, there was a scholar who was like, well, yeah, I think, the schools are, you're onto something there. We kind of ignored the schools. The schools are an important piece, but it doesn't really change anything. And in my gut, I kind of knew that was wrong. And so I wanted to find out, no, I think the schools are important. They're more important than just another piece. Still, we see parents deciding where they're going to live based on the school that their kids would attend. And in the past, they did as well. But what I found is that was something that was new and that was being sold to them. Developers would get control of the school board and the planning board in order to make sure that they had superior schools that could serve their new developments, right? So they could sell home lots and then close Black schools anywhere near that area and force Black parents to the other side of town.
I was talking to someone recently about the book and this conversation, just trying to quickly summarize the theme, because, I want the people around me to understand how important this is. And one thing that just kept coming up was educational redlining, because I know Black people know what redlining is. So would that be an accurate assessment, educational redlining?
I think that's really interesting. And I'm so glad that people recognize the word redlining and the damage that was done and the role that government on all levels, right, federal, state, and local, played in creating segregation. One of the points that I make in the book, because my book ends before the New Deal, and so redlining is really tied to New Deal housing policies.
Mm-hmm.
But the folks that I'm writing about were responsible for those New Deal housing policies. So I'm kind of looking at what's happening beforehand. And so sometimes I feel like redlining becomes kind of shorthand for the creation of segregation and all the harm that came with it, right? Because segregation in and of itself isn't the problem. But the real harm is when communities are denied access to resources, when you have sacrifice zones, when you dump all the pollution in one area, when economic development moves in the opposite direction and jobs are not close by, when you're not investing in parks and schools and such things like that. And that's exactly what happens, right? Is that you really crush communities after they're segregated. I think the Tulsa massacre that took place at this same time is a good example of, what can happen when you have segregation. You can burn a complete community to the ground and not harm white property, right, when people are segregated. And so I think this is really important, but I also think it's important that we understand where this is coming from and why the federal government acted in the way that it did and what kind of what redlining was. Because if we start to say the government did this,
Mm-hmm.
the only solution, the only institution that we have that is powerful enough to start to dismantle this is government. So we need to know who used government and for what end. And that's really what my book is about. I think redlining is important, and but it's important in understanding the story that came before that. If you look at the redlining maps that were created in the 1930s, they look an awful lot like the racial zoning maps that were created in the 1920s, because the same people created both. And it was those racial zoning maps that the courts declared unconstitutional. You can't use them. You can't enforce them through the police powers. You can't arrest people, but you can use them to place schools and other kinds of resources that will still determine where people live.
Well, one thing I think I read, how developers really appeal to white families' ambitions and insecurities, you know, really when they were, intentionally creating, I guess,
Yes.
these neighborhoods. So maybe you can explain more about how the U.S. government did work with developers to appeal to white homeowners.
You bet. I want to back up a little bit, and talk about those parental anxieties, and they really come out in times of economic anxiety. And so you see them now, right? You see them in the 1970s. You see them in this time period during the Progressive Era and into the 1920s. And you also see them earlier, right, in the antebellum period. And you see parents, middle-class parents who have the resources, who really pour all this time and energy and resources into their children, right? That intensive parenting to make sure their kids are okay, right, and land safely in a competitive, cutthroat economy. And so housing becomes part of this, right, with the idea that we're going to tell people that you can only raise kids in single family houses, that is the best environment for a child. And you see this in parenting advice books. The government is promoting this, right? The parent education movement is promoting this. And you see it in advertising too, that apartments are harmful to children. Now, I haven't seen any research that actually shows that that's true, but that message was just everywhere. They would say to kids in school, like, if your parents owned their own home, you'd get a little button that you could wear to school. If you can imagine the stigma, right, for the kids who don't get a button. So this is kind of this profit motive to sell houses, that this is good for kids. And it's not just the single family house, but it has to be in a neighborhood full of single family houses.
Yeah, neighborhoods with big lawns and quiet. Yes. Definitely those types of neighborhoods, we call them the suburbs, right? Well, after the break,
Yes.
we're definitely going to speak more with Karen Benjamin, author of the new book, Good Parents, Better Homes, and Great Schools, Selling Segregation Before the New Deal, which includes stories about Raleigh, Charlotte, and Winston-Salem. You're listening to Due South.
The following is a Due South Encore presentation.
You're listening to Due South on WUNC. I'm Leoneda Inge. I'm here with Karen Benjamin, an associate professor of history at Elmhurst University in Illinois. We're discussing her new book, Good Parents, Better Homes, and Great Schools, Selling Segregation Before the New Deal. Could you paint a picture of what an ideal neighborhood looked like in the early to mid 20th century?
Well, that's such a great question, because it really depended on who you were talking to.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the early 20th century, a lot of people would have said, I want to be close to work, and I want to be close to shopping, and I want to be able to walk where I need to go, and I want to have a lot of things going on. Parks are already important, and of course, the school is important. So these residential parks are trying to get people to move away from what they valued in many ways. And they're doing it by saying, we're going to build you a new school that's going to have all these amenities that maybe the old schools are being denied, right? So now that your kids can go into an environment where there's going to be, less traffic, and there aren't people who shouldn't be there, right? Who have no reason to be there because they don't live there, won't be there anymore. And that the neighborhood, everything will look very similar because of all the deed restrictions. And that's a huge change from what traditional development looked like. And schools are a big part of that, because the one thing that everyone agreed on, right, was that a good neighborhood is one that had a good school for your children, that was accessible. And so everything else about what made a good neighborhood, they're really selling this kind of different idea, and they're layering economic and racial segregation right on top of it, and changing the way urban development looked.
So I know in 2024, it marked the 70th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. You know, researchers, who've tracked segregation, definitely since, when I go back to the 1980s, they found that it's grown significantly in the years since. Like, it hasn't reached pre-Brown days. It's gotten close, but how much of that is due to housing and neighborhood planning, you think?
I think that a lot of it absolutely has to do with housing, right? Because we created such a segregated world that by the time Brown comes around, the only way to truly integrate schools, not just token desegregation, is through busing. And then the Supreme Court says you can't bus across district lines, which creates an out, right? So we have all these outs. Charter schools create an out. Vouchers for public schools create an out of desegregation. And so every time you find a solution that actually might accomplish something, there's a way to get around it. And that's why I think the parenting piece is really important, because we have to convince people that segregation is bad for everyone. And there are lots of reasons why that's true. That unless we really get to the core of what is causing people to seek it, that, this court decision or this win is just going to, it's going to move the needle, but then the rules of the game change again.
It almost sounds like a soundtrack of my life. I was born in the 1960s, and I just remember my parents saying all the time, what was and what wasn't, and where we couldn't live and where we had to live. And that's when they decided that their children would never attend a school that ended in academy.
Yeah.
Because my father said, I know why that school was built.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely right. And I look at the activism of Black families dating back to the early 20th century to get those schools built, because the idea was that if you educate people beyond the positions you want them to serve in, right, then you're going to lose that cheap labor.
That's right.
And so there's no reason to invest in those children. And Black families would not allow that. And one of the most successful and effective ways to do that is that affluent Black families, Black men first, and then after women could vote, so they could have blocks on bond elections. You won't build a school for my kids, no school for your kids. There won't be any schools. And that put pressure on places like Atlanta, where they actually had to start building Black high schools and modern Black elementary schools. But of course, then, white folks would completely lose it if there was a Black school that was better than any white school in the area.
Well, I'd like to play an excerpt from a PBS American Experience documentary called The Harvest, Integrating Mississippi Schools. This is Tommy Naylor, a former member of the State Education Finance Commission, talking about Mississippi's investment in keeping schools segregated after Brown v. Board of Education.
Since 1956, the state legislature has provided $80 million for school construction. 70% has been spent for colored schools and 30% for white schools. Each week for the past 3 years, we have completed an average of 3 new buildings or additions to buildings. Contracts have been awarded for over 5,000 classrooms, about 3,500 for colored children, and approximately 1,500 for white children.
Now, Karen, was this common practice when I think of states that were particularly resistant to desegregating schools? Like, we're just going to put money behind it and build you a school over there.
Oh, you bet. Think of the date, 1956, right around the Brown decision, just before and just after. They were equalizing all over the place. Think about Ligon High School and the year it was built in Raleigh. That was kind of this last ditch effort to push back against the Brown decision as it was becoming a reality, to try and save school segregation. So absolutely, you saw a lot of school construction at that time for Black schools to try and maintain segregation. So you have, the Supreme Court saying this is unconstitutional, and then you have all these brand new Black schools opening after that decision.
I want you to define the suburban residential park. Sure. I know that it really had, I guess, a detrimental impact, when on interracial friendships among young children who probably, they always say the small kids, they don't care what color you are, really, it's their parents.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's just so much evidence for that, that's dating back all through this period. So that, this idea of the residential park is a planned community. So instead of selling an individual lot and then that buyer decides what to do with it, you're going to have a developer who might hire someone, an engineer, right, to plan out the streets. All the lots are going to be measured and very similar. And you're going to put all these deed restrictions on them, how much of a yard you have, how much you have to spend on the house, what can be built, what can't be built, where it can be built, where it can't be built. Curvilinear streets are often a part of that, right? So it goes off the urban grid, so it doesn't feel urban. And usually these are built on the outskirts of town. So they're kind of blocking traditional urban development from continuing outward as it had in the past. And then the developers put a lot of money into creating the sidewalks and the roads and the parks that they sometimes build into those. And so they want to sell those lots for a lot of money. And so that's why they're really controlling who and what you can do for your property to keep those lot prices high. So this is a really different thing where instead of having maybe a block that's all white houses and then the cross street is all Black houses, and then around the corner, there's some more affluent families. And then on the other corner, there's some poorer families, right? And there's stores and other things mixed in. You might have hundreds of houses that are all within the same development. And so in the past, your neighbor was, whoever was in kind of shouting distance from your front porch. Now your neighbor might be anyone who lives in this broader community. And these are all people who should be like, your kids, they should call them associates, even in the ads, not your friends, but your associates, right? The people you might marry or, your future business associates or business partners that are all supposed to be providing upward mobility. And so instead of having kind of this mixed use, mixed race, mixed class, you now have these large developments where everyone in them is supposed to be very similar in background.
I want to backtrack a little bit, take us back to Raleigh. How did Raleigh again become a test city for residential segregation, including, of course, its schools?
Great question. In some ways it wasn't the same kind of test city. Winston-Salem really was, right? Like Winston-Salem.
Oh, let's talk about Winston-Salem.
Yeah. So Raleigh is interesting, though, because it's small and it has such a large middle class that it was really able to create substantial residential segregation simply through the schools, determining where schools go, and pushing people right into the southeast corner of the city, and then drawing affluent white families into the north and the west. Winston-Salem, late 19th century, is about half black, half white, has a large working class, which Raleigh doesn't have. Raleigh has a lot of, government property, right? And it's downtown. It's drawing a lot of black workers for the tobacco industries and factories, and then also, for Hanes underwear, et cetera. It's lots of factory workers there. And so there was a really early desire to start controlling where black families could live. And the word family is really important, right? They didn't talk about black homeowners or black renters or black men. They talked about black families because what they meant were black children, right? Controlling, because what we don't want is black children and white children growing up and getting married, right? And so this is one of the things that is a tremendous concern. So the earliest restrictive covenants, racial restrictive covenants that I found so far after the 14th Amendment, which, right, that makes that unconstitutional, and after the racial covenants targeting Chinese residents in California were declared unconstitutional, were in Winston-Salem, late 1880s, early 1890s. They're starting to use and experiment with this. And if you can imagine at the time, lawyers are saying you can't do that, but they do it anyway. And they get away with it for decades until it becomes pretty standard. Winston-Salem also experiments with segregation ordinances, which Raleigh never does. And Winston-Salem creates a racial zoning map, which Raleigh never does. All of these uses of the police power will be declared unconstitutional, not because of concern over discrimination against Black families, but because it creates unsaleable properties and it hurts white property owners, right? That's what Buchanan v. Worley's about. But what Winston-Salem found was, once again, that same piece of we can promote voluntary segregation through schools, and they're very explicit in explaining that. And so Raleigh and, the folks in Raleigh and the folks in Winston-Salem are in conversation with each other and borrowing from some of those things. And so Winston-Salem on a number of issues is first in terms of experimenting with segregation.
So when you look at Winston-Salem today, how would you describe it? How would you, did those test case and the work they did and segregation, how's it faring now?
Well, I think it's very effective. If all you have to do is go to a site like niche.com and look at the ratings for all of the schools in the district and look where all the A pluses are and the A's are, and then look where all the, B's and the C's are. And that maps really well onto, if you go to city data and look at data on income and data on race, those things map really well. And that's why sites that are talking about schools, when you click on the school, it will also tell you the property value surrounding it, right? All those things are really tightly linked. So you can still see that impact in Winston-Salem. But what I'm really impressed with is there are so many folks in Winston-Salem who are trying to address that. And they're talking about that. And I'm actually going to do a book talk in Winston-Salem in August. But even before this, right, there are organizations and churches that have really been working on trying to undo some of the damage that was put in place early in the 20th century. And so that provides some hope for me. Even if we're not seeing that wholly, I am really worried about the private school piece, as well as the damage already done by charter schools, because you really have to have everybody buying in to the desire, right, to dismantle this, to make it work. Because as long as you create pockets where people can flee to, they go.
Mm-hmm. I know this book's release is quite timely. I have to ask you, in what ways do you think the themes you've explored here really reflect our current political movement? The moment that we're in right now?
Absolutely. I feel like you really see this through some of the economic anxiety that brought us here. And then it becomes really easy to start blaming, DEI or immigrants or trans people for some of the systemic problems that have really, really deep roots, and then double down on things like, you see language with HUD now, instead of trying to dismantle segregation, we're going to preserve the suburbs, right? All the coded rhetoric that I saw in the early 20th century, I'm seeing it again, which is a little bit scary. We're going to dismantle the Department of Education. Our local school systems were designed to be unequal, like I just told you, right? Because they were designed to sell property and to move people into various places of the city. And so
now urban planners are trying to advocate for a return. They want mixed-use neighborhoods.
Right.
And they want the people in the suburbs want their schools back in the city. It's amazing.
It is. But we're going to dismantle the Department of Education that was trying to work towards more equal schools, right? So a lot of the things that we're trying to actually move the needle in the right direction, I feel like we're moving in the wrong direction again. And so we really need to remember this history and how we got here so that we can continue to push forward and understand that, the damage and the harm that it has done to our cities, and that we don't want to go backwards and double down on some of the same policies that got us here. You were saying something about people wanting to have schools in the cities now?
Again, there have been a lot of old schools renovated, even in Durham, North Carolina, where I am, but they've been renovated for a different whole population now. They were inner city, urban, pretty much black schools, but not anymore.
For sure. And that's something that's really interesting in your area, I think in particular, in the Research Triangle area. But a lot of that, and because once again, old schools don't mean the same thing that they did in 1920. You don't have outdoor toilets, right? These are the schools that were built that were really modern in the 1920s, and they're beautiful, and they put a lot of money into them. And in some cases, were built around the Brown decision once again, and they put some money into them. And, they're using gifted programs, right? Like, you come to this school and then your kid can be gifted, and we're going to provide all of these programs for you. That does lead to some gentrification, but that gentrification doesn't lead to integration. It leads to displacement, and it just pushes the people who live there further out of the city and further away from resources and resegregating. So we really need to be mindful of what happens, right? When instead of promoting integration, we're really just gentrifying and displacing people.
Well, Karen Benjamin is an associate professor of history at Elmhurst University in Illinois and author of the new book, Good Parents, Better Homes, and Great Schools, Selling Segregation Before the New Deal. Karen, thank you so much for this history lesson.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
You're listening to Due South on WUNC. This is Due South on WUNC News. I'm Leoneda Inge. We've heard about the many threats to our crucial pollinators, from pesticides to overdevelopment. Now there's a new threat to honeybees, a keystone species in our environment. An invasive hornet has made its way to the United States. Is North Carolina ready? Our colleagues at WUNC's podcast, The Broadside, brings us the story. Here's host Anissa Khalifa.
There's a flying menace that's wreaking havoc in parts of the South.
Officials at Clemson University are urging South Carolina beekeepers and the public to be on the lookout for an invasive hornet.
Well, yellow-legged hornets found and their nests destroyed in a county in South Carolina. We've got a picture.
The yellow-legged hornet is an invasive wasp that first showed up in Georgia back in 2023. Since then, it's rapidly expanded its footprint and become a serious threat to an important pollinator, the honeybee.
They are extremely predatory towards honeybees.
So they're like serial killers.
Yeah, basically.
And while a small army of scientists and beekeepers are tracking the problem and trying to slow its spread, they've been warning that the next stop on the front line could be North Carolina.
Everybody's watching. Everybody's waiting to see when this thing is going to show up here.
I'm Anissa Khalifa. This is The Broadside, where we tell stories from our home at the crossroads of the South. This week, the fight to save honeybees from a murderous hornet.
My name is Emily Cattaneo. I am a freelance reporter based in Raleigh.
Emily writes frequently for The Assembly, an outlet based in North Carolina. There, she's covered a wide range of topics, from the hype behind the mega gas station Buc-ee's to Bigfoot culture in Appalachia. And recently, they sent her on assignment into the world of beekeeping.
I know some beekeepers here in North Carolina and know that the beekeeping community is extremely robust here. And we actually have the largest beekeeping association in the country.
Really?
Yes. And
I did not know that.
yeah. So when I heard about this threat, this very dramatic, gruesome threat, I thought, well, this is a really interesting clash to report on.
So what is this clash? Like, what is this problem that you're reporting on?
So the problem I am reporting on is the yellow-legged hornet. This hornet is invasive. It conquered Europe over the last 20 years, and it showed up in the States 3 years ago in the port of Savannah, and it has been working its way north ever since. Beekeepers and those who love bees here in North Carolina are battening down the hatches, preparing for if and when the hornet comes here, because it is extremely invasive and extremely deadly to honeybees.
So how did these predatory hornets get to Georgia in the first place?
Sure. So, of course, nobody knows for sure what happened, but the theory is that a hornet queen flew into a shipping container somewhere in China or Southeast Asia 3.5 years ago and woke up in the port of Savannah and flew out of her shipping container. She was probably already mated, and she went out and started a nest. And the thing about these hornets is one nest can produce 500 queens.
Whoa.
So then they go and they found their own nests.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a very invasive species. So these hornets started making their nests. They pretty much have all been in the low country in South Carolina, in sort of hard to reach marshy areas. And they're really going after the honeybees there. And they travel about 50 miles per season. And everyone's just waiting to see whether they're going to cross the border into our Carolina.
Emily says the scale of the threat on the North Carolina border becomes pretty clear when you see one of their nests.
It is a big boy. Yeah, these guys get big really fast. I described it in my story as about the size of a seated toddler. It's very round, about, I guess you can't see what I'm doing, but like from the bottom of my torso to my neck, size-wise, and sand-colored, lots of whorls and dips and combs. So these things are really big, a lot bigger than some of the other native hornets' nests.
But what makes these hornets such a concern is how they interact with honeybees.
They are extremely predatory towards honeybees.
And they do this through a hunting behavior straight out of a horror movie called hawking.
Like a hawk, like a bird of prey. And basically, they're like, I'm hungry. I know where I'm going to go. I'm going to go to a beehive. So they go to a beehive. They cluster around the entrance. You can see videos of them like jockeying for the best position. And they just wait until bees are either leaving the nest, or even better, if they're coming home from foraging and they're really tired. And then when they're coming home, the hornets will attack them, behead them.
Oh my God.
Eat their insides or viscera for protein, and then either fling the bodies to the ground for the beekeeper to discover later, or bring the bodies back to their own nests to show off.
So they're like serial killers.
Yeah, basically.
So let's talk about honeybees for a minute, apart from their gruesomely killed bodies. What is the benefit of honeybees? Why is it so important to protect them?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple different reasons. First of all, there's honey production. There's a huge demand for local honey in North Carolina, as there is in many places. And we actually already don't produce enough honey here to meet that local demand. So if these hornets come and they kill off so many of our honeybees, and or the honeybees are afraid to leave their nests and go forage and the nests die off, then we're not going to have that honey that, is so important to so many people. There's also the potential threat to agriculture. Agriculture is huge in North Carolina, obviously, and honeybees are really important pollinators. So without them, we could see an impact on the fruits and vegetables and flowers grown in this state.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, in the course of my reporting, I found that almost the most important thing about the honeybees that I witnessed was how important they are to the beekeepers and to the people who love them. People were talking about how beekeeping is like therapy to them, that it just becomes this really, really important thing to them. Like they really care about their bees the way that we might care about any other kind of pet. So these bees don't just have utility, they also are like somebody's way of life. 50,000 people's way of life in North Carolina.
Wow, 50,000 people.
That's what I heard, that there are 5,000 people in the association, but it's estimated that there are 10 times that many who keep bees in North Carolina.
Typically best to inspect from the back of the hive because the bees fly out the front door.
Should I grab my phone?
Yep, hold your phone and just pop this open. So that is Propolis.
I spoke with a guy named Whitaker Granis, who's a president of one of the beekeeping associations down near Fayetteville.
If we can see the queen, that'd be awesome. But if we can see signs that the queen has been here.
He showed me some teaching hives that he has kind of tucked back on some, I think, state land.
What is a teaching hive?
It's a place where people who want to learn about beekeeping can come and he can show them like what it's all about.
So we are checking on the amount of resources that this hive has. We're going to look for both pollen, which is their protein.
He's ride or die for bees. But he is a when, not if kind of guy when it comes to the hornets.
And while we're hopeful that they are going to be able to do containment and keep these yellow-legged hornets constrained to one area, the reality is that they have already expanded beyond that. And they've already traveled hundreds of miles. If they don't hitch a ride on a truck, that means we're 2 to 3 years away from them. If they hitch a ride on a truck and come by one of the big highways, they're probably closer than that. So it's time to start getting prepared for this new threat to our honeybees in America.
So how are beekeepers preparing themselves to face this yellow-legged hornet? How do we fix this?
One really important tactic that they are presenting to the state's beekeepers are these traps. There's nothing fancy about any of this monitoring. So basically they get these like gallon jugs and cut a little square hole in it. And they fill it with something called Georgia juice, which is half grape juice and half brown sugar. And bees do not like Georgia juice, but hornets do.
Okay. So then you're selecting for the hornets.
Exactly. So put it in front of the hives, and hopefully when the hornets show up for their gruesome murders, they see the Georgia juice and they're like, oh, a little appetizer. And then they get stuck in the trap, and the beekeeper can see them and report them. And, it's really interesting. When I first started reporting this story, I imagined that there would be some major issue in fending off this threat. Like there wouldn't be enough funding or no real plan for how to do this. But I was actually really pleasantly surprised. This actually ended up being a pretty optimistic story to me, even given the fact that it's about murderous bugs trying to eviscerate honeybees, because I feel like the way that the state's beekeepers and beekeeping regulatory authorities and such are trying to stop this is actually pretty sound. And it really seems like this community is so passionate about bees and that there is such a reachable and functional state regulatory arm when it comes to apiaries that, they have a good shot, or at least everybody is kind of in it together and working on fighting it together.
Okay, so big important question here. Where are these hornets right now? How close are they to actually getting to North Carolina?
Yes. So on Thanksgiving of last year, a beekeeper noticed hawking behavior in York County, South Carolina, which is just south of Charlotte. And they found a nest there.
Okay. Yeah. So they're very close by.
Yes, they are. I personally think they will show up here at some point, but some of the people I talked to are hopeful that I'm wrong.
With this threat looming on the border between North and South Carolina, beekeepers have been diligently watching for any signs of the hornet's arrival. And for a while, they'd successfully kept the wasp at bay. But then, just a few days after we talked, Emily got an update.
Hello. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? What's been going on?
Yeah, the hornets are in North Carolina, so that's bad.
This is Due South on WUNC News. You're listening to an excerpt from the Broadside, and its episode titled, "A New Threat to Honeybees Emerges in the South." The story continues now with host Anissa Khalifa.
Okay, Emily, so you have an update for us on these hornets. What's the latest?
So, last week, the state got a call from somebody in Union County out near Charlotte that there was a hornet snooping around her hummingbird feeder. And it was suspicious enough that she called the state. So they raced out there and found additional hornets near the Union and Mecklenburg County lines. They sent them off for testing, and as of yesterday, they confirmed that they are indeed yellow-legged hornets.
Oh, no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has crossed the border.
Ugh. So now that they're here, what's the plan of action?
They're looking for the nest, because just because the hornet came to North Carolina once doesn't mean that it has to take over the whole state. And they are trying to find the nest using those traps that I mentioned earlier. So I understand they have 200 traps around the house where the hornet was spotted.
Wow.
And they are using those to try to lure the hornet. And then when they see it, drink from the trap and then take off again, they can hopefully follow it and use that to find the nest and remove it before they make more inroads here.
So what does this mean going forward for honeybees in North Carolina?
Yeah. We knew that this was a distinct possibility that they were going to come here. And frankly, it seemed like it was only a matter of time. Just because there has just been one nest doesn't mean that there have to be dozens more. Hopefully they can contain it. And the way to prevent the spread is for the owners of honeybees and just for civilians, like this woman had a hummingbird feeder, to know what these hornets are, keep an eye out for them, and if you see something that looks suspicious, then tell the bee inspectors, and hopefully they can track it down and prevent the hornet from killing all the cute and important honeybees in our state.
All along, it seems like people have been sort of anticipating this, and there's been a community, effort to monitor and see if they're here, like you were telling me before. But now that they're actually here, do you see this response like ramping up in any way? How do you see people kind of meeting the moment, as it were?
Yeah. Well, I will say that I found out that they were officially here when one of my sources, Whitaker Granis, the president of the Cumberland County Beekeepers Association, forwarded me the press release. And he is actually out on parental leave. He's not working. He's taking a step back from his beekeeping duties, but he still took the time to send me this press release. So I think that shows that people are really invested in this, and everybody was on the edge of their seat trying to see what was going to happen. And while it's too soon to see whether this changes the community response, because people just found out that it was officially here, I would imagine that, it's going to continue in an amplified way what people were doing previously, putting out the traps, spreading the word, keeping an eye out, and really trying to batten down the hatches and hope that the hornet doesn't spread to more counties.
What are you going to be kind of keeping an eye on or following with this story going forward?
I'm going to keep an eye on whether they find the nest. I think that's the next big thing that we should be paying attention to. Also, if there are more nests. I mean, there is kind of a worst case scenario. Was happening in the Low Country in South Carolina, where there are lots and lots of nests in hard to reach areas. I hope that doesn't happen here, but I will be charting the march of the hornet and seeing whether this ends up being an isolated incident or something a little bit more serious.
Thanks so much for hopping on the call to give us this update, Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to help.
Thanks to our WUNC colleagues at the Broadside. This was a co-production with The Assembly and reporter Emily Cattaneo. Charlie Shelton Orman produced the segment for WUNC. Jarrett Walker was the editor. You can find additional episodes of The Broadside and Due South at WUNC.org. Due South is a production of WUNC News and a broadcast service of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Our producers are Stacia Brown and Rachel McCarthy. Ben McNeely is our contributing producer, and Ella Klein is our intern. Denarius Thomas is our technical director. Aaron Keever is our executive producer. Theme music comes from Quilla. For Jeff DeBeery, I'm Leoneda Inge.
The fatal shooting of a teenager at a protest in Seattle has gone unsolved for 6 years.
This is open in your face. How are there no answers?
Our investigation has uncovered new evidence and witnesses who say they've never talked to police.
Did police ever call you?
Not once.
Listen to We Keep Us Safe, a new true crime series on the Embedded podcast from NPR.